Hi, everyone. We'll be starting back with the panel at 10 after, but I wanted to remind you of some of the housekeeping issues. We are, as you're seeing, people are putting up ideas for links for us where we can get more ideas about, learn more about other folks who are working in this space, what books you'd like to see in our book clubs or speakers you'd like to hear. So keep that chatter going in the chat box. Also, the links for registering for the conversations with Eve Poole and Ross Baird and David Robinson Sr. and Jr. are going to be there. One other thing, when you registered for this webinar, you got an invitation to join our newsletter from MailChimp, and we want you to do that so we can stay in touch with you. So if you don't mind, reply to that and confirm that you would like to receive a newsletter. One of the main perks I get out of this job is being able to learn something new and be reminded of some of the core things I care about every time I go to work like this. So thank you, Jed and Edgar. Thank you particularly for telling the origins of your faith stories and the origins of the land you're speaking from. Also to Jed in referencing St. Francis and the connections that St. Francis made for us between the earth and the church when he heard God tell him to rebuild the church. And Edgar, for your reminding us of that circular relationship we have with God and with others and ourselves, which is always a deep and growing place to be. I'm located in North Carolina, just outside of Asheville in Swannanoa, on land that was originally belonged to the Katua Cherokee. We purchased this land 10 years ago from the family who took it in the 1930s from the indigenous people who had been here forever. As Jed says, it's hard to own that ugly, but it's true. This, of course, brings us all full circle, asking all those questions of who owns what anyway, and where is God in all of this? How are we people with the privileges we have in property ownership, with capitalism and wealth? So we're going to turn for a few minutes to trained theologians who are going to answer all those questions, I'm sure. Right? Mark, Reggie, Kenda. As I said earlier, they're unique because they've all attended SoCal and they have this frame of reference about money and meaning. They spend their time teaching, leading people in the areas of social entrepreneurship and money and the church. Mark Sampson, who's going to lead this conversation, was the first person I ever met who had a PhD in both theology and economics, and I've been following him around ever since. He and his colleagues at Matrushka House in England and now at Rooted Good here in the US have been movers and shakers in this space for a decade. I'm going to ask him to say a bit more about his work and introduce more fully our other panelists, Kenda Creasy-Dean and Reginald Blunt. So Mark, if you would take it.
Thank you so much, Rosalie. That's very kind of you to say that. Yes, so my name is Mark Sampson. I'm the director of Rooted Good, along with two other colleagues who I think are also on this call. And yes, I'm also a sort of part-time theologian, I guess, as well. And as you probably can tell from my accent, I am from Britain. And I moved, my dwelling place is now in Michigan and of the last couple of months. So I'm kind of experiencing all of this, parts of these conversations in a new way and being rooted in this land. And I'm encouraged by Jed's admonition to own the ugly. I think being a white British male might sort of be the ticket on that. And so I'm just acknowledging that at the beginning of this conversation. And yeah, I'm really excited by this. Part of what I'm going to be doing over the next few months and years, hopefully, is going to be curating some of the economic theologies aspect of this faith and finance conversation. And we're really interested in how this is going to develop. And we're just so delighted with the tone and the content of this opening discussion. So I really want to thank Edgar and Jed for that. I believe that you guys have modeled how we like this conversation to continue, that you've both wrestling with systemic and structural issues about, our current economic systems and capitalism, but also the injustices in our institutions. But you've done that also in a deeply personal way. And I just really want to thank you for that. And it means a lot to me, and it means a lot to all of us that you've brought yourselves fully into this conversation. And we just want this to be a space that continues to do that, where we can be wrestling with the systemic and the structural, but also recognize that's always deeply connected to the personal and our own journeys. And I want to thank you for how you've had the conversation, but also I think you've pointed the way for us from where we need to begin as well. And Edgar, I just really want to thank you for showing us that we've got to be really honest about the starting points of these conversations. And your honesty around the wealth and where wealth comes from, and the deep injustices in that story, and that if our starting point is not grief and lament, then are we ever going to get where we need to go, both personally and in terms of the conversation? And I think I'm a Christian theologian, and I think particularly for those of us from the Christian tradition need to pause and stop and acknowledge not just that we've been silent around these issues for many years, but that we've been complicit and we've been proactive in these injustices and inequities surrounding economics and wealth and money. And of course, the irony and the tragic irony of that is that there's immense resources in the Bible and in the Christian tradition that speak of a radical alternative to what we've been complicit in. And of course, there's also a massive diversity of Christian communities and Christian traditions. And whilst my own has been complicit, there's been others that have, in the monastic communities, in African American and in other communities, which has had a different economic narrative and a different understanding of all of these things. And so in the Christian tradition, there's this tension of what's our starting point. And I think, thank you for acknowledging the significance of the grief and lament for where things have come from. But also, I think both of you said, and it's very interesting, I think Jed, you said at the beginning, before we talk about money, we need to talk about separation, which is fascinating. And Edgar, in the same way, your narrative of this from separation to togetherness, to reciprocity and mutuality, this narrative that both of you spoke about, that before we talk about money and wealth, we need to step back and ask these deep questions about what does it mean to be human? And I love that, Jed, in your book, The Purpose of Capital, you genuinely go back to the beginning. Like you say, okay, we're going to have to start at the very beginning to unpick this understanding of how capital has come to function in the way it has today, and therefore how we might reimagine it. And Edgar, your phrase, all my relations, being this wonderful sort of shorthand for the integrated, holistic picture that both of you point towards in your work, and this move from separation to this. And I think there's such rich framing, resources, ways of thinking, imagination in that to help us frame our sort of theological response. So how might we, from faith traditions and faith communities, with this kind of theologic, God thinking, I guess, and understanding who God is and what God has done in the world, how might we reform personally our own economics, and as practitioners around innovation, what we create in the world, but also the systems and structures of the economics in which we function. So I am delighted to pass over this conversation to Kenda. And Kenda, before you respond, I invite you to respond as you'd like to Jed and Edgar's work and what they spoke so eloquently about earlier. I'd invite you to just say a little bit about yourself and what you're currently doing, where you are, and how you sort of interact with this conversation. Kenda.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to all of the people who are giving up voluntarily hours of their day to be on Zoom some more. So my name is Kenda Creasy-Dean. I teach in practical theology and education at Princeton Theological Seminary. I teach things like youth ministry and spiritual formation and social innovation. At Princeton Seminary, I mean, I think my take-home phrase from this whole conversation might be "own your ugly." And I'm aware with this conversation that we also sit on land originally owned by the Lenape tribal nations, and our current owning of the ugly at Princeton Seminary has been to come to grips with a slavery audit that was recently completed. So there's a lot of that that has economic impact here at the seminary too, how we deploy resources as a result of all of that. I was thinking this whole conversation, which I'm so grateful for. I've been convinced in the last decade, I guess, that churches and our whole economic model is, in need of an alternative. And it's hard to think about ministry without thinking about social innovation. And so that landed me at SOCAP, which landed me in conversations with the people on this call. But it's kind of a whole meta reflection on Isaiah 55 too. Why do you spend your money on that which is not bread? Why do you labor for those on that doesn't satisfy? And the tension between that and in Deuteronomy, I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life so that you and your children may live. And, churches like wealth itself, we've let ourselves believe that there's a lot of things that we spend money on that's bread, that's not. In a lot of cases, it's actually toxic. So what happens is we wind up thinking that we're choosing life when it's becoming increasingly obvious that, in fact, the opposite is true. We're investing in sawdust, not in nourishment. And how do we get people to tell the difference, right? We have to somehow allow them to experience what real bread tastes like. And I think that's in some ways what both of your books allow us to get a glimpse of. So both Reggie and I actually come from Methodist backgrounds, and one of the things that you hear about John Wesley saying when you are in a Methodist seminary is, it comes out every year during stewardship campaigns, that Wesley said, earn all that you can, save all that you can, so that you can give all that you can. And that sounds like bread on the surface, and it probably was that in the 18th century. And the story that came to mind when I was thinking about this, you probably read about this a few years back. There was a kid at Princeton University who, he was a philosophy major. He was like the star student of the philosophy department. He had a chance to study philosophy in Oxford after he graduated. He turned it down in order to work at a trading firm on Wall Street. And the reason was, he said, if I can take a high-paying job in finance, I can donate more to charity. And sure enough, he did that. As a 22-year-old, he was giving $100,000 a year to charity. His goal was to give away half of his income in his lifetime. There have been others who have done this. The philosophical name for this is effective altruism. And so it looks like bread, right? It looks like it would be a life-giving path. It looks like it's choosing life. The earning to give movement, it was called, where you deliberately chose a high-paying career to maximize what you could give to charity. But it doesn't translate as naturally as we might think, right? Because it doesn't take into account, for example, who's being abused in order to do the labor that maximizes those earnings, right? What is the ethics or the nature of the business model that underlies finance capital? Is giving money away better than allowing people to do meaningful work that sustains them and honors them? So I appreciate a lot what both of you have done in various ways to present capital as an imagination shifting lever. What if is a central category for both of you. And I have been captivated by the fact that Jed created a musical called What If in order to promote the thesis of his book. And Edgar, your idea of a free imagination is necessary for healing and purpose is a massive way of thinking about that. What if wealth is used to heal and connect and restore? What if stewardship really isn't about money or what it takes for institutional survival, but impact on human flourishing? What if that's how we thought about stewardship campaigns? What if it's more theologically responsible for the church to shift our economic practices and allow people to create their futures instead of getting really good at charity, which may or may not empower people? What if the church had an alternative imagination about money? I appreciated, Mark, you're mentioning that there have been alternative Christian communities throughout history that have done that, like the monasteries. So anyway, we were asked to talk about opportunities and challenges. I'll just list a few that I heard in both of your remarks that were important for me. The opportunities, I kind of zeroed in on the action steps that someone was mentioning in the chat. The action steps that come to mind immediately are, number one, practices of restraint. I was part of a clergy group once where the theme was enough is plenty, in order to share resources of inequitable compensation. Practicing restraint is part of what Christian communities have learned to do. I noticed that Jed quoted in his book Martin Luther King saying that our scientific power has outrun our spiritual power, which means just because we can doesn't mean we should. So practices of restraint, like Sabbath, which was mentioned earlier, to stop, take a step back, stop producing. That's not what we're made for. What we're made for is a new way of being. Anyway, the practices of restraint were the first place my imagination went. The second place was the importance of theological reflection in this conversation. Both of you guys were deeply articulate about how the ties to your own personal faith identity have kind of undergirded where you come out in this conversation. And it's that theological reflection that allows us to make this shift in imagination. It's what allows us to own our ugly, because after all, our wholeness doesn't reside in us anyway, it resides in Christ. The third practice was, how do we use money for healing? Edgar, your idea of the money of medicine is so captivating. What happens if Christian communities began to think about bringing together their resources in order to be medicine for others? And then the last opportunity that came to mind was, what happens if Christian communities and not just investors begin organizing their lives, their practices around the metric of ESG, environmental, social governance? We might even add another S for spiritual priorities. But I think that if we became explicit about those things as our metric for value, it would change our practices on a daily basis as well. So those were the opportunities that came to mind. I also, of course, had, I was feeling really challenged in other ways. And I'll list 5 of the ways that will live with me after this call. One challenge is, what does it mean to live within the framework of abundance rather than scarcity? And what does it mean to try to help people live abundant lives if our neighbor is not experiencing abundance? So I think Christian witnesses would say it's impossible to do that. When one part of the body suffers, we all suffer. So how do we move towards abundance while recognizing and participating in the suffering of our neighbor? The second challenge was the idea that money is not something we do to each other, that what we want to do is kind of liberate people's imaginations. I think Edgar said that. But I've got to say, I've worked with a bunch of churches over the last several years on a number of grants, and churches are terrible at having new imaginations, particularly around money. One of the things I've learned is how badly we are in terms as Christian communities at understanding, using, and accounting for money. Our assumption, somehow we revert to the least spiritual part of our identities when it comes to that topic. And it's particularly obvious when it comes to trying to imagine thinking about money in new ways. The third challenge for me is, what do we do with capitalism? I mean, late consumer finance capitalism in particular, the kind of capitalism that we have right now. What do we do theologically with the impulse that we want to do well while doing good, which undergirds a lot of social entrepreneurship? I don't think that's really what the movement is about, and I don't hear that in either of your conversations. But I think it's a real question that rank and file Christians have. What do we do with the fact that we live and function within an economic system that has some real liabilities built into it, or at least the way we've experienced it does? The fourth is, how do we how do we get Christian communities to practice detachment? And what I mean by that is to be able to simply hold resources as gifts rather than as possessions. That means we can relinquish it, we can release it. There's a sacrificial part of the Christian story that has to reframe what abundance looked like. Abundance doesn't mean we get to keep a lot more stuff. Abundance means that we don't have to hold it so tightly. And the last thing, I'm really challenged by the idea of moving bulk capital into communities of color. But of course, that presumes that we can also relinquish our need for others to use capital the way we want them to. And how do we begin to risk that? I'll close for now and turn it over to Reggie.
Yes, Reggie, thank you so much, Kenda. That was fantastic. Really appreciate that. Yeah, Reggie, if you could start by sort of introducing yourself and what you're up to, and and then respond to Jed and Edgar. That'd be great. Thank you.
Well, let me thank everyone who has made it possible for me to be a part of this awesome conversation. Thanks to Jed and Edgar for what they have shared with us, and great to be as part of this response panel with Mark and Kenda. I am Reggie Blunt. I'm on the faculty of Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois, and I teach also in the area of practical theology, particularly Christian education, youth and young adult ministry, and also been doing some work around congregational leadership, of which the whole notion of stewardship and institutional development has been a part of my work, and which has drawn me into these kinds of conversations. I'm also the senior pastor of Arnett Chapel, African Methodist Episcopal Church on the south side of Chicago, in a community that has not had the benefit of equitable treatment. And so I live and work directly in some of these spaces that we are speaking about. Again, I'm grateful for this opportunity to be a part of this conversation. And again, thanks to Edgar and Jed for their sharing. And I'm probably going to be dittoing and repeating much of what's already been said, but maybe I might say it in a different way for folk to be able to capture what's already been shared. I came across this quote that said, behind every economic theory, there has to be an anthropology. Behind every economic theory, there has to be an anthropology. And what I read and what I have heard from Jed and Edgar is really that. Before we even get to the conversation, before we even get to talking about capital, it really is, what's our anthropology? And I think you said it, Mark, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean? How do we even see other parts of humanity? Jed talked about the need to talk about separation of self from others before we talk about capital, and Edgar talked about how do we see other human beings and about the fact that we are all interconnected. And so it leaves for me that though we have lifted up and know the challenges of capitalism, capitalism may not necessarily be our problem. Anthropology is. And I think that when we have these conversations, we tend to gloss over a need to have a real conversation about the value of all humanity. I think that sometimes we enter these conversations, even in this social impact conversations, as if we're all on the same page as to how we value humanity. And I'm not sure of that. And as Jed said, I think that we need to stop. We need to pause. We have to own our ugly. I think that is going to be the phrase that we're all going to leave here with. We have to own our ugly and begin to have some real conversation about how do we truly understand and value humanity. And so from a theological standpoint, that is saying that we have to wrestle with our own theological anthropology. And so I'll just give mine quickly and offer it up for discussion for others to chime in. But simply, I do believe we're made in the image of God. I do believe that all humanity has sacred worth. And when I think about being made in the image of God, I believe that what that says is that all humanity possesses various characteristics of God. And the ones that I believe that we primarily possess is the ability, the power to love, the power to create, and the power to heal. Power to love, power to create, and power to heal. And part of that notion also is that the belief that God doesn't have a hierarchy. But I think what ends up happening, and this is where I think our faith communities need to own their ugly, is that our practice of our faith often demonstrate that God does have a hierarchy. Racial, gender, sexuality, this belief that God has a hierarchy, that there's one group of folk that God sees that is better than the other. And we live that out in our various practices as we engage in various systems that we operate in. And so I think that it's hard to really talk about and live out issues of equity and inclusion, or to talk about equitable practices if our anthropology hinders us, if our theological anthropology hinders us. I think about the denomination that I'm a part of, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. For many of you who may or may not know about the AME Church, we are the first denomination to be founded on American soil. Our founding took place in the city of Philadelphia during the times of the United States coming into its own, and right during the formation of the country. And our founder, Richard Allen, was right in the thick of things that was taking place in Philadelphia. His biographer would say that had Richard Allen been white, he would have been considered one of the founding fathers of our country. The AME Church was founded off of a benevolent system of the Free African Society, which was committed to caring for others, engaging in various levels of benevolence, particularly in support of persons of African descent. But it was also right in the heart of another pandemic that took place during that time called the yellow fever. And it was right in the heart of caring for others and supporting others and serving others. And that has been at the heart of our denominational's commitment and work all throughout from 1700s all the way up until now. The challenge that our own denomination has had is that our congregations are making social impact in the communities that they are engaged in. Many of our churches are doing soup kitchens and daycare centers and providing healing spaces and all of that. But though we were part of the original fabric of building this country, we have not received the same equitable support in being able to make greater social impact that we probably could in the communities that we serve. And so, to Edgar's point, I think that we do need to find ways of shifting resources to communities of color, those who are on the ground already doing great work and could do even greater work if they had the resources to make that happen. But that begins with the shifting of our anthropology. If we don't believe that people are of equitable, equal value, particularly for those of us in faith communities, and believe that we are of equitable value in the sight of God, then it's going to be very difficult for us to shift our practices, because our behavior is going to be shaped by what we believe. No matter how we slice it, no matter how we work it out, if our heart is not believing that we are all humanity has sacred worth, then our practices will not reflect that. So I'll stop there. I really enjoy being part of the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Reggie. I'm going to invite Jed and Edgar back into the conversation now. And yeah, we've heard some fascinating responses there from Kenda and Reggie, and I just would like, to hear you guys respond to anything that you heard there that you want, that sparked something in your mind that you want to respond to, or challenge, or anything like that would be fantastic. So I don't know which one of you like to go first.
I think I'll
right,
defer to Edgar.
Edgar's going to go first. There we go.
Sure. One, I would just say I'm just really honored to be in this space, and I'm very encouraged. This is the first time I think I've been in a space where all of my identities feel like they are coming together in one conversation. So it's really reaffirming, and also to just hear from you all who are teaching the next generation of faith leaders and have such important positions to influence the future of faith communities and the church and how capital is moving, to know that you are like-minded in your ideology and are really helping to shift some of the stories that have been passed down that are harmful, right? Like, we have the opportunity as people of faith, as spiritual beings, to rewrite that history. So I just wanted to say thank you. I feel very supported and seen and inspired by you all today, and look forward to the work ahead.
Thank you so much, Edgar. That's really nice. Jed, I don't know if you want to jump in and respond to anything that you heard that kind of sparked something.
I'd like to respond to everything, but there's just so much. I mean, really, this has been just a phenomenally rich conversation, and I'm really pleased that Rosalie and her team are kind of creating a space for this discussion to kind of go forward. And I really like the idea that we're not trying to replicate a conference in a point in time, but rather facilitate a conversation over time. And I think that's really what's needed here. I think that we're talking about how do we connect, again, in relationship with each other and with the other. And that is it's a tough process, because it's an approach and a withdrawal. It's a process of engagement and reflection and engagement. It's praxis in terms of, having a thought and an understanding of something, applying that in practice, and then having to revise and reform and refrain what it is that you're doing based on that experience and new thought. I think that one of the things that I take away from this is really an affirmation of this relational nature of self and being, if you will, and that it manifests at so many different levels. I mean, we could spend all day talking about it, from the discussion about the work of the church in the inner city that's been going on for decades, and what that means as really the place of wisdom around how to do this work in community, or thinking about, for each of us individually, what are the educational and other experiences that we need to have. I'm thinking about Darren Dodson, who brings together asset owners and investors in essence a fund of funds, and then collaborates with the Impact Journey, which brings folks together from a diversity of backgrounds to have very, very tough conversations about perspective and capital and community with folks who don't normally get to interact. And I think that that's what we need to try to focus on, is how do we have some conversations with people who normally don't see each other, and so they don't hear each other, and so they don't see each other. And I think it's really in the process of hearing and engaging that you see people in different ways, and that you see opportunities differently. And so I think that's really part of the opportunity we have. And it's challenging, because you kind of, you dance with them that brought you, right? So it's kind of like figuring out who are the people that I don't know that I need to know? What are the communities that I need to be hearing from that aren't even registering for me? I mean, this is part of the, the grand challenge and the grand opportunity is to really challenge ourselves to seek out those conversations, those actors, that engagement in a way that we may not naturally do. And that I think really makes it less comfortable for us because we have to go into areas in our own selves that we don't necessarily have to explore or challenge on a regular basis. So I think it gives me a lot of this. I do want to say one other thought is that I had spoken earlier about the whole notion of mutual impact and that we become transformed in the process of trying to transform our world. And I think that the comment that was made earlier that Edgar touched on in terms of restorative justice, I view the process of pursuing restorative justice as the collective manifestation of mutual impact at the individual level. And that it is these two kind of parts of a whole that come together. And if we as individuals open that process of restorative justice in a way that it allows us to grow from that engagement, then I think we have possibilities and hope for actually doing what needs to happen in the world.
Thank you so much. I have a specific question for both of you, Jed and Edgar, if you'd like to respond. I see both of you being in spaces that have historically been quite unilateral spaces in terms of the flow of money. Edgar, you addressed that very specifically in your book. And you have a great critique in your book about the word altruism and all that is carried with that word and the privilege and power, even that word suggests. And Jed, in the same way, you're continually confronting this notion that capital exists to create more capital, right? Like this kind of, and the unilateral nature of the investor over here and the investee over there. And in that, you're trying to, from my perspective is, feel free to, you're trying to create a more mutual relationship. And it's like, Jed, your idea of mutual impact, the idea the investor can be transformed as much as the investee, and Edgar, your reflections on reciprocity. And so I think some of my work around economics and theology, it comes to a very similar place of trying to rediscover, I guess, an economics of mutuality. That actually maybe Adam Smith was wrong. He famously said it's not the love of the neighbor that motivates the baker and the candlestick maker and all this, but it's their self-interest, and he set in motion this notion of self-interest at the root of all economic behavior. And I feel that both of you are somewhat prophets of mutuality in that you're calling us to actually this question which Reggie identified is, well, what if Adam Smith was wrong? What if to be human is not to be self-interested as your starting point? I'd love to hear a bit about your story about can you remember when this notion of mutuality or this exploration started taking place in you? And to unpack a little bit of that, Edgar, I'd love to hear about, I read in your book about your increasing awareness about your being a Native American and what that meant for you and that kind of journey there. And Jed, if you want to reflect on that as well, that would be sort of fantastic. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, I think for me, it came pretty early on as I started in my career in philanthropy at a pretty young age. I was 28 years old, a program officer at a pretty large foundation with a significant portfolio that was mostly investing in white-led institutional kind of organizations, universities, healthcare systems, those types. And as I got out of the ivory tower, out of the office into the community to really explore who else was doing work to shift the needle. And at that time I was working in a health-focused organization. What other ways were folks in my community, what strategies or what were they doing to shift the quality of health in communities. And although university research and healthcare systems absolutely had a role, there were a lot of other ways that people were implementing programs at the community level that have been invisible to the foundation. So I felt like I was caught in this place of like, yes, we need to give money to support those programs, but yet those very programs have so much to teach us. Like we might be getting it wrong, or we might have only half of the answer here. And, so, and that's where I also begin to see the resistance of bringing that wisdom that wasn't from a place where the organizations typically tap for expertise, And so, I think I started working in my career in an institution that was very much the charity model of philanthropy, and really this idea of altruism that I actually think is potentially harmful. I think the idea of altruism is a fundamental reflection of this separation paradigm, us versus them, or us needing to help them, and it's quite linear, as you said, like one direction. Versus the native worldview, which shifts from altruism to reciprocity, understanding that there is a fundamental interconnection. And I often talk about the word here in the US, there's a slang, a derogatory term called Indian giver, which is if you're a kid and you give someone a toy or whatever, and then you take it back, they're like, oh, you're an Indian giver, right? And that word actually does come from an indigenous idea about giving gifts, because ultimately no gift is free. We give with the understanding that in my time of need, you will give back and take care of me. So it is reciprocal versus I'm giving to some people over here that I don't know, that I'm not connected to, and I will never need anything from them in return. And so that's why I think I push back on ideas of altruism to moving us to a place of a reciprocity, because of the idea that we all are inherently connected and need each other.
Mark, I got lost in listening to Edgar's words, and I can't remember what your question was.
It's your discovery of mutuality coming from a context in investment which is more linear, sort of unilateral, sort of a one-way exchange.
So I think that my background is all in community work and youth development and advocacy. And I reached a point, I was the founding director of Larkin Street Youth Center in San Francisco. And from that experience, I kind of woke up at 29 and really felt like the whole thing was just phenomenally full of shit. This is the late 80s, and my job as an executive director was to make people cry about street kids, and they would give me money. And so the whole transaction was based on what I thought of as politics, perception, and persuasion, but not performance. And it was really this, the reference to effective altruism is really like predicated on rape, pillage, and philanthropy as the practice. So that there you could separate these out, right? And I just reached a place where I was just kind of like, it had really had a negative effect on my own psyche, because all I wanted to do since I was a kid was change the world and be a part of the nonprofit sector and create positive community and all these great things. And I realized that I had become part of this poverty industry in some ways, and that, our services were not compensated based on transformed lives, but by numbers of kids served. And it just seemed wrong on just so many levels. And the whole thing was wrong. And so I think that my idea of the mutuality piece comes from that background, where we used to always say that volunteers always get a lot more out of the volunteer experience than the people that they're volunteering to serve, right? And I think that in my work with families and ultra high net worth folks, helping them reflect on some of these issues and themes, we get trapped by the roles, and the wealth, it is never enough, and it's almost always too much. And so I think that the trick is, how do we even open ourselves up to that idea that we are being affected in this process? We're trapped in this process. And in fact, the purpose of capital, to my mind, is fundamentally to function as a fuel for freedom. and a fuel for liberation and a fuel for justice and to drive us forward. And that's really what we have the possibilities to pursue. And the great thing is there's no real answer for like what that looks like. That shifts and changes in the context of how it is brought forward by different shareholders and stakeholders engaging in these tough conversations. And so the mutuality piece is all about being and becoming. It's all about this process for all of us. And so I think that's how it started resonating for me pretty early on as part of my exploration.
Oh, thank you so much, both Edgar and Jed. And that's really rich. And I think it's a fantastic way of kicking off this conversation and exploring some of the theological context and contours of this as well. And we just really appreciate that. I'm going to turn over to Rosalie. And we're all very grateful, Rosalie, for you kicking this off, as you've kicked many things off before, and we hope you kick many things off in the future. Thank you so much for enabling us all to have this really rich and transformative conversation.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Jed and Edgar and Kenda and Sarah and Reggie. This has been an amazing conversation. I'm sorry we haven't been able to get to all the questions. There are lots and lots of questions. Great conversation going on in the chat thread. The thing for me was during all of this was hearing the feedback from many of you that you had been longing for, or maybe even longing for and not even knowing you wanted this conversation, but bringing a conversation you could bring your whole self to. And I'm just really thrilled that we were able to have this conversation, and for me to find out that I was not alone in wanting this conversation. So thank you all for that. Just a reminder that on June the 3rd, we will be having this conversation with Eve Poole, and Mark Sampson has had the opportunity to work with her in the past, and it has introduced me to her. And I feel like when I started reading her work that I was shocked that there was somebody writing about the things that I had been thinking about. It was like, wow. And we're thrilled that she's going to be with us. And then Ross Baird, I have been his fan since the day I met him in the work that he's done with Village Capital and around the world. And then to also get to have David Robinson Jr. and David Robinson Sr. in that conversation is going to be great. That's on June the 12th. So look for links and ways to register for that. And thank you all so much for your participation in this.